They assumed he was just another black man to intimidate, another name to process, file away, and forget. But within mere minutes of mocking him, the balance of power in the courtroom shifted. The judge, once wielding absolute authority, suddenly found herself answering questions she never imagined facing. What unfolded inside those walls would not only rattle an entire city, but forever reshape the very rules of justice. Dear viewer, what you're about to experience is not just another story. It is a profound testament to the silent, relentless pursuit of justice in the forgotten corners of society, places most would rather ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories like this inspire, challenge, or provoke your thinking, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon. Every day, we amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for being here. Now, let's dive into the story. At exactly 8:27 a.m., the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B inside the Charleston County Courthouse creaked open. Inside, the room was already half full, a living mosaic of hushed whispers, crossed arms, and restless glances. A charged energy clung to the air, thick with things unspoken. Locals had a name for it, the Broderick effect. Attorneys respected it. Defendants feared it. And anyone who had ever practiced law in this corner of South Carolina knew its bite. Presiding over this room was Judge Evelyn Brick, a towering figure in the local justice system for the past 25 years. Her influence had grown like stubborn ivy, twisting deep into the very foundations of Charleston's courts. Judge Brick never needed a shout. Her sharp tongue and even sharper biases did the work of 1,000 gavel strikes. Her bench was more than a seat of judgment. It was a throne. She wore her black robe not as tradition, but as armor, wielding it with precision, authority, and when she chose, cruelty. It was said she never forgot a name, especially the one she despised. Names like Malcolm Pierce. Malcolm Pierce wasn't new to her courtroom, but he remained a thorn in her side. At 46, Malcolm had built a reputation that stretched well beyond the corridors of his Atlanta law firm. He had argued before federal judges, sat on panels about racial justice and reform, and earned a reputation as a man who couldn't be rattled. What made Malcolm truly dangerous wasn't just his resume, it was his composure. While others buckled under threats or thinly veiled disdain, Malcolm studied it, absorbed it, let it reveal its own contradictions. Today, he entered courtroom 3B not just as another defense attorney, but as a quiet storm dressed in a crisp gray suit. His eyes scanned the room methodically, not to intimidate, but to calculate. Every bench, every bailiff, every fleeting glance in his direction was noted and filed away. He moved like a man who belonged, even in a place designed to remind him he didn't. The case was State versus Isaiah Cooper, a 38-year-old black Marine veteran, now accused of assaulting an officer during a traffic stop. A leaked snippet of the dashcam footage hinted at a far more complex reality. Isaiah, seated and clearly unarmed, was tossed without warning, yet nuance rarely found refuge in Judge Brick's courtroom. Here, narrative, not evidence, reigned, and Isaiah's story had already been rewritten in her mind. Isaiah sat shackled beside Malcolm, his shoulders hunched, his gaze glued to the floor like it had betrayed him. Malcolm leaned in close and whispered, steady and sure, "You're not what they say you are. I just need you to trust me to prove it." The room fell silent as the side door creaked open. Judge Brick entered, every step rehearsed, every movement deliberate. Her black heels clicked against the polished tiles in a chilling rhythm. She ascended to her seat behind a towering bench. The stage was set, and this time, the script was about to be rewritten. The bench adjusted her glasses and stared straight ahead, offering no acknowledgement to anyone. Then her gaze locked onto Malcolm. A thin smile curled at the edges of her mouth, not warm, but knowing. She shuffled the stack of papers before her, tapped her pen once against the table, and leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice smooth, like silk stretched almost too tightly. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Charleston's courtroom's not quite high profile enough for you these days." It was a jab, carefully cloaked in civility. Malcolm didn't so much as blink. "I go where justice fails, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady. "And unfortunately, that tend to be more places than I'd like." The room shifted. A few eyebrows rose. A bailiff straightened. But Judge Brick only smiled wider, the kind of smile that never touched the eyes. Well, she said, flipping back to her docket, try to keep the soapbox moments to a minimum. We're not filming a documentary. She chuckled softly to herself. The laughter echoed longer than it should have, bouncing off the heavy courtroom walls. Just like that, the stage was set. Opening statements were scheduled for 10 a.m. The gallery was already filling up, a low hum of chatter growing louder. Reporters began to trickle in, not because of the case itself, but because of the brewing showdown. Malcolm Pierce, the relentless defender, versus Charleston's so-called Iron Lady. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was an event, and those didn't come often. Isaiah Cooper, Malcolm's client, sat stiffly beside him, visibly tense. His eyes flicked once toward the jury box. Still empty, but he already sensed the uphill battle ahead. Malcolm placed a calming hand lightly on the table between them, a silent signal. Hold steady. Malcolm knew this wasn't just about Isaiah. It was about every Isaiah who had ever been silenced, trampled over, forgotten. And Judge Brick, she knew it too. She leaned back, surveying the room with the casual detachment of a director preparing for a curtain call. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and spoke. Let's make one thing clear, Mr. Pierce, she said crisply. I do not tolerate grandstanding, race-baiting, or courtroom theatrics. If you plan on putting on a show, I suggest you take it to Broadway. Malcolm nodded once, measured and slow. I'm here to present evidence, Your Honor, he answered calmly. But if this is theater, he added, his tone sharpened just slightly, then I will simply play my part. The courtroom froze. It wasn't awkward silence. It was a charged one, heavy and waiting to break. Murmurs stirred in the back rows. A reporter started scribbling furiously. Judge Brick's jaw tightened. She realized too late that this would not be an ordinary trial. It would be a reckoning. Neither Malcolm nor Judge Brick said aloud. Not yet, but the atmosphere crackled with the truth. Something was about to change. What none of them knew was that before the sun would set on that courtroom, the woman who once laughed at Malcolm Pierce would be escorted out, not as a judge, as a suspect. The fall always starts at the top. Judge Evelyn Brick, seated at her mighty bench, didn't realize she had already begun to slip. The courtroom had always been her empire. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward, obedient to her authority. Judge Brick didn't just preside. She commanded, orchestrating every proceeding like a maestro conducting a symphony. Every trial was hers to manipulate. Every outcome a note in her masterpiece of control. That morning, as she adjusted her robe with the self-assurance of a ruler secure on her throne, she had no inkling that the fortress she built, one of fear, silence, and submission, was crumbling. And the cracks weren't coming from without. They were emerging from within. At the defense table, Malcolm Pierce stood calm, poised, and ready. His posture radiated quiet power. Beside him, Isaiah Cooper sat present in body, but hollow in spirit. The unmistakable look of a black man hauled into court not for justice, but for punishment rubber-stamped by tradition. Judge Brick began the proceedings with a bite sharper than necessary. Mr. Pierce, are we ready to begin? Or are you still organizing your theater props? She asked, her eyes darting toward the court reporter before he could reply. We're ready, Your Honor, Malcolm answered smoothly. He had no interest in matching her pettiness. His mission was simpler and far more dangerous. He intended to expose it. Meanwhile, across the aisle, the prosecution team, led by the assistant district attorney, prepared to launch their opening attack. But neither side could have guessed how the day would end. Ethan Ridgway could barely hide the smirk curling on his face. Young, white, and eager, Ridgway was exactly the kind of attorney Judge Brick preferred. Pliable, ambitious, and more than willing to weaponize courtroom procedure for the sake of appearances. As the opening statements began, Ridgway crafted a narrative of Isaiah Cooper, agitated, threatening, and dangerous. He wrapped his words in polished legalese, careful to mask the racial undertones lurking beneath the surface. Malcolm sat quietly, hands folded on the table, watching with patient calculation. When his turn finally came, he rose slowly, his voice steady and clear as he addressed the jury. Isaiah Cooper is a father, a decorated Marine, a man who served his country with honor and distinction. Malcolm began. The prosecution wants you to believe you should be defined by a single moment, one we intend to prove did not happen the way they claim. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. But I ask you this, what if the system is simply more comfortable believing he's guilty than asking whether it was wrong? Before Malcolm could return to his seat, Judge Brick's voice cut through the air. Mr. Pierce, she said sharply, you will refrain from philosophical grandstanding. This court deals in facts, not moral hypotheticals. Malcolm didn't argue. He didn't have to. He had already seen the subtle shift among the jurors, the slight leaning forward, the tightened jaws. They had heard what mattered. The trial marched on, each exchange sharper and more volatile than the last. Malcolm cross-examined the arresting officer with surgical precision, highlighting discrepancies between his written report and his testimony. He questioned why the body cam footage mysteriously began only after the most critical moments. He pointed out the glaring absence of physical evidence linking Isaiah to the alleged assault. Each time Malcolm gained ground, Brick found a way to undermine him. Objection, relevance. Ridgway would bark. Sustained. Brick snapped, cutting Malcolm off mid-sentence. Objection, leading. Sustained. Objection, argumentative. Sustained. It became a pattern, a rhythm so obvious that it didn't need words to be understood. In her courtroom, the walls didn't just echo Brick's authority. They amplified it. What Brick failed to notice, however, was how visible her hand had become. The jury, though silent, had started to fidget. A woman in the gallery, who had remained stone-faced for the first hour, now leaned forward intently. Even the court reporter's strokes across the page seemed sharper, more deliberate, as if preparing for history to be made. Then came the moment that began the true unraveling. Malcolm called a new witness, an independent forensic analyst who had reviewed the footage and exposed timing discrepancies. Before the analyst could complete his third sentence, Ridgway jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this witness wasn't disclosed in our original pretrial documents, he objected. Malcolm stepped forward, his tone even. That's false. His name was included in the amended list submitted to the clerk's office last Wednesday. Brick narrowed her eyes. I don't recall receiving any such amendment. I have the time-stamped copy here, Your Honor, Malcolm replied, lifting the document. Brick didn't ask to see it. Instead, she turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice sharp, please disregard the last few statements. The defense has attempted to introduce surprise evidence without proper notification. Malcolm's voice dropped a register. Colder now. With respect, Your Honor, the only thing being surprised here is the truth. The room went still. Brick's eyes blazed. One more comment like that, Mr. Pierce, and you'll be held in contempt, she warned. Malcolm didn't flinch. He met her gaze, unwavering. Contempt, he repeated softly, is watching justice be strangled by formality. For the first time, Brick hesitated. Then, snapping back to control, she barked. Enough. This witness is dismissed. The forensic analyst stepped down, confused and frustrated. Malcolm didn't protest. He wasn't allowed. Instead, he turned to his client. Isaiah's hands gripped the edge of the table, his face tight, breathing carefully. Like a man fighting to stay afloat in a storm he could neither name nor escape. Malcolm leaned in close and whispered, We're not losing. We're collecting. Collecting glances. Collecting notes. Documenting every violation, every cut, every dodge. Every time Brick tried to silence him, a new record was written, one she would never see coming. Outside the courtroom, the air was changing. Quiet murmurs began to gather force in the courthouse halls. The local press, usually indifferent to quiet tragedies unfolding behind courtroom doors, had taken notice. Something about this case, perhaps Malcolm's unwavering composure, perhaps Brick's blatant bias, had cracked the dam of indifference. Inside, as the prosecution rested its case in the court recess for lunch, Judge Broderick sat taller than ever, confident she had maintained control. But Malcolm Pierce knew better. He understood that this was never about convincing the judge. It was about letting the walls speak louder than the bench. And before the day was done, those walls would start to crumble. During the lunch recess, while the courtroom buzzed faintly with conversation, Malcolm remained seated at the defense table, slowly turning a flash drive over in his hand. It looked like nothing, a simple, everyday object, yet it held more power than anyone around him could have guessed. It hadn't been part of his plan. In fact, it had arrived just that morning, slipped anonymously into a manila envelope, and delivered to the front desk of his hotel. No note, no return address, only a short, slanted scrawl across the envelope. Play this before closing arguments. Malcolm wasn't one to gamble on mysteries, but something deep inside him told him this wasn't a bluff. As his client, Isaiah, stepped outside with deputy for a brief lunch break, Malcolm plugged the flash drive into his laptop, right there at the defense table, surrounded by murmuring clerks and reporters refreshing their phones. He clicked open the loan video file. What appeared on the screen made his breath catch. It was courtroom footage, but not from Isaiah's trial. It was a case from 3 years earlier. The video showed Judge Brick on the bench, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. A black defendant stood before her, speaking, barely audible, until Brick cut him off mid-sentence, her voice sharp and cold. But that wasn't the real shock. The camera had captured a private sidebar, accidentally left recording by an open courtroom microphone. Brick leaned toward the prosecution, unaware the mic was still live. He'll plead. They always do. Just push him a little harder. We'll move this along. I don't have time to waste on another one of them. The air in the courtroom grew denser, almost suffocating. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, pulse hammering in his ears. Casual racism, open manipulation. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was recorded, documented, undeniable. Suddenly, everything made sense. The blocked witnesses, the discarded evidence, the pattern of disproportionate rulings. This wasn't incompetence. This was orchestration. His hand hovered over the keyboard. He knew the weight of what he held. If he played that file in open court, it would be nuclear. There would be no walking it back. He could destroy her career in an instant. Was it the right moment? Just then his phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. You're not the only one she's buried. Time to dig her up. The decision crystallized in Malcolm's mind. When the court reconvened, the room settled back into its familiar hierarchy. Judge Brick returned to the bench, every movement precise, composed. Her eyes skimmed past Malcolm with the faintest hint of a smirk. But Malcolm didn't flinch, because now he held something she couldn't interrupt, overrule, or dismiss. And he was about to press play. As the afternoon session began, the walls of courtroom 3B felt quieter than before. But it wasn't a calming silence. It was a silence that tightened itself around the ribs, coiled and waiting for the inevitable snap. Judge Evelyn Brick took her seat with the air of someone certain she had already won. Her posture was proud. Her voice, just slightly more clipped than it had been that morning. If she noticed a change in the atmosphere, she didn't show it. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. Malcolm, however, noticed everything. The juror who hesitated a fraction of a second before sitting. The two spectators exchanging a charged glance in the back row. Even the bailiff, long loyal to Brick, whose gaze flickered ever so briefly with something that looked suspiciously like doubt. The cracks were beginning to show, and Malcolm Pierce was ready. Loyalty faltered. Eyes that once met Malcolm's gaze directly now shifted away. He had seen it before, that slow erosion of fear, the moment when silence begins to feel like complicity. But this time, Malcolm had something far more powerful than any legal brief or eloquent motion. He had evidence, a raw, unedited truth captured on video. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now recorded. Undeniable, unaltered, damning. In less than an hour, that truth would play in a courtroom that had silenced voices like his for decades. But for now, he waited. The court moved into closing arguments. Ridgway, the young assistant district attorney, stood first, smoothing his tie as though it were a badge of honor. His voice rang out, steady and confident, carrying the polished cadence of a man convinced that tone alone could triumph over truth. He painted Isaiah Cooper as a man who had snapped, who had disrespected lawful authority, who posed a threat to civil order. It was a performance, and Judge Brick watched approvingly, her chin nodding almost imperceptibly, like a conductor keeping rhythm to his speech. When Ridgway finally sat down, Malcolm rose. No theatrics, no pacing, no sweeping gestures. He placed his hands lightly on the defense table, his eyes fixed, not on the judge nor the gallery, but squarely on the jurors, the people who still had the power to choose. Isaiah Cooper did not snap, Malcolm began, voice even, composed. He didn't swing. He didn't threaten. He didn't resist. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to land. What he did, Malcolm continued, was far more threatening to a system that doesn't expect people like him to speak at all. He stayed calm. He asked questions. He asked for respect. He let that linger. Respect, he repeated, his voice firm, is not a privilege. It is a right. Malcolm turned slightly, his eyes scanning the jury. And when the footage we tried to show you was suppressed, when testimony was cut off, when every attempt to explain was overruled, you witnessed firsthand what happens when that right is stripped away. Judge Brick shifted in her seat. Malcolm didn't miss the way her fingers tightened around her pen. And maybe, Malcolm said, lowering his voice, you felt it too. Not the fear of being arrested, but the fear of being unheard, the fear of being dismissed before your words even leave your mouth. He turned slowly toward the judge's bench. And in some rooms, in some courts, that silence isn't an accident. It's by design. You could have heard a pin drop. Malcolm stepped back from the podium, nodding once toward Isaiah, whose eyes finally met his, not with fear this time, but with something closer to hope. Thank you, Mr. Pierce, Brick said, her voice tight. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will now begin deliberations. But she never finished. Malcolm raised his hand, calmly but decisively. Your Honor, before the jury is dismissed, the defense has one final submission, newly surfaced material, directly relevant to this trial's impartiality. Brick's eyes narrowed. The time for evidence has passed, Mr. Pierce, she said sharply. This, Malcolm replied smoothly, is not evidence against my client. It's evidence concerning this court. The room stiffened. Proceed carefully, Brick warned. Malcolm inhaled deeply, then, without another word, turned the laptop toward the court's projection screen and pressed play. A grainy video flickered to life. The courtroom. 3 years ago. Judge Brick seated at her bench. Her voice, unmistakable, rang out clearly. They always plead. Just push him. I don't have time for another one of them. The audio filled the room like an explosion. Not screamed, not dramatized. Just spoken, casually, cruelly, as if it were routine. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A juror covered their mouth. Another leaned forward, disbelief etched on their face. Brick's gavel slammed down once, twice. Turn that off, she barked. This is inappropriate. Malcolm remained unmoved. It's your voice, he said, calm but cutting. This is what you said here in this courtroom, about a defendant who looked like my client. You didn't care about the facts then. He paused, letting the silence bury her. And you don't care about them now. You don't now. Brick barked, her voice sharp, her composure cracking. I said turn it off. She rose from her chair in a sudden jolt of anger. I will, Malcolm replied steadily, once you answer for it. The bailiff stood frozen, unsure whether to move toward the bench or the projector. Malcolm turned directly to the jury, locking eyes with them. You've heard a lot this week, he said, voice low but steady. But what you just heard tells you everything you need to know about how this trial has been handled. At the defense table, Isaiah Cooper sat motionless, staring up at the woman who minutes earlier had seemed untouchable. Now, the robe draped over Judge Brick's shoulders seemed heavier, the authority she wore thinner. The courtroom had turned, and Malcolm Pierce stood at its center. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pleading. He was simply shining a light into the darkest corners. The storm hadn't erupted yet, but the clouds had split, and Evelyn Brick had just heard the first crack of thunder. The silence that filled the courtroom after the recording wasn't the familiar hush of decorum, It was heavier, the kind that presses against your chest and steals the air from your lungs. It was a silence that follows after something sacred is broken, a silence that marked the end of an era. Judge Evelyn Brick stood stiffly behind her bench, trying to mask a tremor in her stance. Her face, once so composed, betrayed her now. No mask could hide the truth that had just been laid bare. This wasn't a slip-up. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a truth that had lived for years in whispers and weary glances, in quiet resignations from those who had understood the system was never built for them. And now it was undeniable. The voice on the recording wasn't just familiar. It was unmistakably hers. In the jury box, jurors exchanged nervous glances. In the gallery, stunned spectators sat frozen. Even the reporters, once skeptical, were now scribbling furiously, chasing every shattered piece of story. The power in the room had shifted so violently, so irreversibly, that the space itself felt unfamiliar. Malcolm Pierce said nothing more. He didn't gloat. He didn't grandstand. He simply stepped back and let the weight of the moment crash exactly where it belonged. On Judge Broderick, on her rulings, on every life she had quietly twisted beneath the gavel. Judge Brick instinctively reached for her gavel, trying to reclaim order. But the room no longer bent to her will. Her voice, still attempting authority, trembled beneath the surface. This proceeding is adjourned until further review, she announced. At the back of the courtroom, a door swung open. 2 federal marshals entered. One held a sealed envelope. The other moved with slow, deliberate steps. Judge Brick's words faltered. Her eyes widened. She understood what was happening even before the lead marshal spoke. Judge Evelyn Brick, he announced, voice echoing to the hushed room. You are being placed under investigation for judicial misconduct, violation of due process, and racially biased rulings spanning multiple cases. You are hereby relieved of duty pending federal inquiry. Her lips parted, but no words came. She simply stood there, stunned. This woman, who had towered over the courthouse like a monument, now looked small, her authority already stripped away. The gavel she clutched didn't fall. It didn't have to. Her power had already slipped through her fingers. As the marshals escorted her from the bench, no one in the courtroom moved. It wasn't fear that held them still. It was awe. They weren't witnessing a fall. They were witnessing a reckoning. Malcolm turned to Isaiah, whose chains, once so heavy, suddenly seemed meaningless. This, Malcolm said softly, is what accountability looks like. And for the first time in that courtroom's history, justice wasn't handed down from the bench. It rose from the floor. The room stayed hushed long after Judge Evelyn Brick was led away, as if the building itself was trying to comprehend what had just occurred. What had once been her empire now belonged to no one. Yet, amidst the debris of her collapsed reign, something else began to rise. Clarity. The newly assigned judge stepped forward, and history turned its page. An experienced and even-tempered man named Harold Winfield now took the bench, carrying a calm gravity that filled the room. He didn't need to raise his voice. His very presence reminded everyone that justice was still possible, even after so much rot had been exposed. With the eyes of the nation now watching, Judge Winfield moved swiftly, but with deliberate care. He reviewed the mistrial motion submitted by Malcolm Pierce, flipping through the documentation with a focus that felt both refreshing and rare, a fairness that had been absent for far too long. There was no scoffing, no veiled sarcasm, just a solemn responsibility of the law, finally applied without prejudice. Malcolm stood to address the court, his voice unwavering. Your Honor, this courtroom is not merely a place for verdicts. It must be a place for repair. For my client to be truly free, it isn't enough that Judge Brick is gone. He deserves a ruling that sees him. Beside him, Isaiah Cooper sat completely still, the weight of trauma still clouding his gaze. He had entered that courtroom expecting a conviction. What he never expected was to witness the collapse of the very system stacked against him. Judge Winfield nodded thoughtfully. I have reviewed the trial record, the newly submitted evidence, and the conduct of the prior proceedings, he said, his voice gaining a resolute gravity. This court finds that the rights of Mr. Cooper were egregiously violated, and that the case was conducted under a climate of judicial bias unbefitting any standard of due process. Then, Turning directly to Isaiah, it delivered the words no one had dared hope for. "Mr. Cooper, you are hereby exonerated of all charges. You are free to go." There was no eruption of cheers, no cries of celebration, just a deep, reverent silence, the kind louder and more dignified than any applause. Isaiah's eyes widened slightly, then dropped to his hands, which slowly unfurled as if releasing something he had been holding onto for far too long. Malcolm placed a steady hand on his client's shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. But they both knew the truth. It wasn't truly over. Not for the countless others who never had someone like Malcolm in their corner. Not for those who never had a recording fall into the right hands. Not for those who had been silenced without a reckoning. Still, this was something. A beginning. A ripple. A shift. And as Isaiah stood unshackled, seen, whole, the verdict that mattered was not just recorded in the legal books, but carved into history itself. In the quiet that followed Isaiah Cooper's release, the walls of the Charleston courthouse stood as silent witnesses to a day that would be remembered for much more than one man's trial. The space that once echoed with Judge Evelyn Brick's cold authority now hummed with something deeper: transformation. For years, the court had operated under her shadow, issuing rulings that carried not only legal consequences, but also the silent, crushing weight of bias too thick to name aloud. Her word had once been final, her demeanor untouchable. But like all systems built on unchecked power and whispered corruption, hers eventually cracked. And through that fracture, truth spilled out. Malcolm Pierce never entered the courtroom seeking to be a hero. He came to defend a man named Isaiah, a man, like so many others, misunderstood, misrepresented, and if not for one determined voice, misjudged. Malcolm had seen it all before. Judges who sneered, prosecutors who played politics with human lives, the silent, grinding machinery of racism reducing dignity to dust. What made this case different wasn't just the client. It was the timing, the preparation, and the rare moment when the system exposed itself from within. From the very beginning, the odds were stacked. Isaiah had done nothing to deserve arrest, much less a trial. He had been polite, cooperative, calm, during a police encounter gone terribly wrong. But he had fit the description, a phrase that had become a bitter anthem of American injustice. He was presumed guilty long before he entered the courtroom. And Judge Brick, cloaked in years of unchallenged authority, saw no reason to question that presumption. Her smirks, her interruptions, all of it revealed exactly what Malcolm Pierce had fought to uncover. And finally, the truth had spoken louder than the gavel. Her open disdain had been part of script Judge Brick had followed for decades. But Malcolm had done his homework. He knew this wouldn't be just another cross-examination. He came prepared with more than sharp legal arguments. He came armed with truth. And when he played the video, when Brick's own voice exposed her prejudice for the world to hear, everything changed. In a single clip, the mask she had worn for years shattered. It was no longer rumor or speculation. It was reality, undeniable and public. The fallout was immediate. Federal marshals walked into the courtroom and escorted her away from the bench she once ruled like a monarch. The power she had once wielded, the power to dismiss people with a glance, now meant nothing. In her place, justice found its way back into the room, carried in the steady presence of Judge Winfield, who reminded everyone that fairness doesn't require a robe. It requires courage. For Isaiah Cooper, the verdict changed his life. But the real victory was deeper than freedom. It was acknowledgement. A system that failed him had, in some small way, finally tried to make things right. His exoneration wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of healing, not just for him, but for all the invisible people who had seen themselves in his place. And Malcolm? He didn't leave the courtroom as a man seeking applause. He left knowing the real work was only just beginning, because the system didn't collapse with Brick's downfall. It flinched. And flinching isn't enough. For every brick, there are dozens more, cloaked in legal jargon and professional detachment, quietly stealing justice under the guise of procedure. The real lesson from this story runs deeper than the walls of any courtroom. It reminds us that silence is dangerous, especially when it masquerades as professionalism. That neutrality in the face of injustice isn't virtue, It's complicity. And that real change rarely comes from shouting. It comes from unwavering resolve, documented truth, and the courage to show up again and again, even when the system tells you not to. In your everyday life, you may not be a lawyer. You may not sit on a bench or argue before a jury, but you are still part of the story. Every time you see someone being overlooked, spoken over, or wrongfully judged, your response matters. Whether it's in a boardroom, a classroom, or even at your kitchen table, your voice carries weight. Justice isn't only won inside courtrooms. It's protected in conversations, in policies, in hiring decisions, and in the ways we teach our children and treat our neighbors. Isaiah Cooper's story should not be extraordinary. It should be the norm that when injustice is exposed, accountability follows. That when someone is wrongfully accused, they're believed, defended, and ultimately freed. And that those who misuse power face consequences, no matter how high their seat may be. So let the story stay with you. Let it challenge you to ask hard questions. Let it move you to action, not just awareness. And if this story shook you, inspired you, or reminded you the kind of world we all deserve to live in, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel. Help us keep these stories alive. Share them. Talk about them. Because real change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we tell the truth and keep telling it until the world can no longer look away.